What would you say is the number one reason why most companies don't grow? I think a lot of people would point to things like marketing, sales, things like that. And I want to argue that it actually might be a different topic, and a topic that I talk about today with Max Olson, founder of Core Acceleration Consulting. And that's the topic of one-on-one meetings. If you're going to build a business, you have to build a team. And that goes from interviewing, hiring, training, and holding accountability. All of those things essentially take place in one-on-one meetings. And your ability to be effective during that one-on-one meeting is crucial as a business owner. And today I had a great conversation with Max, and he is a wealth of knowledge on this. Watch this. You'll get some very practical stuff, and I think stuff that you could take into your business this week to work on and get better. Hope you enjoy. Hey, welcome to another episode of Aleph Ventures TV. Today I'm excited to have a conversation with Max Olson. Max, thanks for taking time to be with me.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Haakon.
Yeah, man. Excited to have a conversation. At Aleph, we do a lot of work with you, and you've been doing some great stuff with the PCA. So was looking forward to this. A lot of folks watching might have come across you at an expo or through the PCA or something, but maybe just to start, give kind of a brief background. You've been around the painting industry for a while. And maybe just hit that a little bit, and then I'll ask a follow-up question on the topic I want to talk to you about. But give us your background.
Good. Yeah, let's go for it. So first background, I originally started my first painting business was a franchise in College Pro, franchising company throughout North America. I ran a business in Seattle in 2000, so it was 24 years ago. Following that, I ran operations for about over a decade, coaching, working with other business owners and franchisees, and then eventually the full-time team, to where I really felt like throughout my career there, learning, coaching, kind of influencing others, moving people towards performance, that's what I really gravitated towards. So that was part of why I started Core Acceleration 5 years ago. Background on what we do: we help trade groups. You mentioned the PCA. We work with trade groups, companies, just improve their learning systems. And there's a lot of really bad training out there. So what we do is take playbooks, processes, systems, expertise in an organization, and we work on both the content and then the actual delivery of training. So whether that's boot camps, workshops, e-learning. We also do a lot of strategic support, stuff like that. And yeah, we're focused on moving performance. That's the biggest thing. So
I love it, man. I've mentioned this in previous episodes. I forget exactly who, but have you heard anybody refer to the College Pro Mafia?
I've heard that. I know that's around.
I don't know. Yeah. Somebody actually, it's not original. Somebody kind of referred to me, but there's this thing, the PayPal Mafia. If you go look at the history of PayPal, it's all these, founders that were all part of, building PayPal. They all individually go on to do amazing things. And College Pro I didn't come up in the College Pro, ranks and background, but that was something I just early on learned about the painting industry. Is it's like a lot of the killers and players in the painting industry come from College Pro. So
there really are a lot of founders, a lot of leaders. Like if you were to look at College Pro on LinkedIn and just see the types of roles and things they have, it's heavily weighted towards owner, C-suite people who just lead others. And part of it is, I think, I felt really fortunate in college to have a chance to actually learn what it was like to run a business, lead others. I had 15 crew members as a 19-year-old. It was a crazy experience, and there's ups, there's downs and all that. But the one thing it's guaranteed is that you're going to learn through challenges. And I think that kind of foundation really opens people up to the whole concept of entrepreneurship and leadership and everything. So
yeah. And I know, this dovetails into the specific thing I wanted to talk to you about, even because I think one of the things that College Pro did pretty well, or trained on at least quite a bit, is how do you do a one-on-one meeting? So this is something that I wanted to talk to you about. You've had an insane amount of reps at this throughout your career, and we connected before recording, and I said this, like, and this has just been true. My job, in director of development, I talk to business owners. So I'm constantly talking to business owners, and I tell you, like, not one of them has not been able to grow their business because they couldn't hire painters, or they didn't know quite how to paint a house. But many of them, their growth is inhibited by their ability to influence people. In a one-on-one meeting with team members is the primary way, week in, week out, that you're going to influence people. So I think it's very, very important conversation. You've had a lot of experience of that. Do you want to just maybe speak to that? Like, what's been your personal experience with a one-on-one meeting?
I think you're spot on, where it's usually not, if someone is not going to succeed in a painting business, it's usually not because you don't know how to paint. And it goes for, it's not just painting business. I think just in general in the business world,
Sure.
Oftentimes people who move into leadership positions start with, doing some of the, foundational, more frontline work in an organization. Somebody can be technically sound at something like painting. It doesn't mean they're technically sound at how to lead a great, one-on-one meeting overall. But that's where you influence. That's your leverage point. You had asked me that question beforehand. I was trying to calculate just how many. It's in the thousands in terms of how many one-on-one meetings, which also means, if I've done, because it was 25 of these a week, back in the day for, 3/4 of the year, over and over and over again, both on, whether it's franchisees, whether it's, staff members or coaches, like a lot of different types of roles, I've led. And if I've done like 2,500 of these, I've probably screwed up like 500 of them, because it's, I think that's where the real learning is, when you walk away from one of these and you just don't think things will change, overall. So I do think it's a really important, sometimes like underlooked or under focused on skill in an overall leader's development. So
and you've been obviously on both ends of it. So you've been the recipient of one-on-one meeting strategy and structure, and then you've delivered it. So I'm excited to talk to you about it. And in reaching out, and again, some of the back and forth, you shared with me like a framework, because like you mentioned, this applies to different businesses, different situations, maybe different levels of leadership. And there's different formats and, titles of meetings and all that kind of stuff. But what you shared with me was kind of like a framework for like, what are the essentials of an effective one-on-one? So I'd love for you to maybe just give us like the table of contents of that, and then let's walk through those.
Yeah. So when you had first kind of posed the question of like, what are we even solving and what we're talking about today, and what are we focused on one-on-ones? I've seen a bunch of different structures. Like there's, for better or for worse, there's a bunch of different formats for how these can unfold. I think there's some universal principles that, regardless of your format, are applicable. Like you said, and what I put down as my kind of top 5, if I were to lay out like, what do I think every system just must have, and every leader, when you're doing a one-on-one, like what absolutely must happen. First one was just being purpose first. Like it's like, understand what are you trying to accomplish in it. And we can talk a little bit more about that in a second. Second one being just preparation overall. Like these should never be meetings where you just come into it and kind of wing it. So preparation is a big part of it. I think it's important to have structure, but without like too much rigidity. And what I mean by that is like, you may have like a clear, agenda outcome. You've got to be able to pivot depending on what the needs are, but you also need to be consistent, where someone knows what they can expect week in and week out. with these. And then the last two are honesty is just a huge one. And I know that sounds pretty obvious, but I think there's a lot of one-on-one meetings that happen where people just don't get real with what's happening or what they're feeling. So honesty is a big one. And then the last one is just follow through. And I think, these are not like one-time isolated things that happen. Like the best, one-on-one meeting structures I've seen, they're connected together. There's clear follow through. There's a purpose behind it. It's like future, focused, not past focused. So that follow through, I think, is, the last big one that regardless of format you need to have.
I love that, man. I think just as you share those, it resonates. So I'd love to just walk through these and just step into practical, some of the nuance and ideas of each of these. And even starting out with purpose, I love that because even when I think about who might be listening to this conversation, there's probably, there's different situations. So there might be somebody who you're listening, you have a salesperson, you have a project manager, but you are the one leading them directly. So you are doing that with them each week. There also might be people that, they have managers that are doing one-on-ones. So, like they might be having a one-on-one with somebody who's doing a one-on-one so I think that purpose thing is important because there's different situations, but flesh that out a little bit more. What's important about purpose in a one-on-one?
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of what you just said on like, when you're doing a one-on-one, you're leading someone. And I think sometimes that, I know that sounds obvious, but sometimes that gets forgotten where, you almost, you go into a one-on-one and you're treating it like, what do you want to talk about today? Open-ended, just, and the person, brings up whatever discussion points they happen to have. And that's the whole meeting, or like, another kind of misdirection with these are just having like a checklist of things and having it be pure status update. Like if a good litmus test is if the one-on-one meeting could just as easily have happened over a Google Doc and over email, you probably don't need to have like the actual, interactive meeting. But as a leader, there should be a clear reason on why you're doing these, and that the person you're leading should clearly, understand why it is. And they should walk away from the meeting like feeling like there's actual value that came out of it, not that they just, informed their boss and now they're going to walk away and not do anything different overall. So I think, and there's a few different purposes for what that be, but I think you need to identify like, why am I doing this? Is this about performance and goals? Overall, is this, are we focused? Is there a like specific, metric that we're going to be, that these meetings are really geared around? Like, these are like the margin meetings. We're focused on margin on these every week. Is this about, understanding like kind of what's currently in progress in the team? Like there's a lot of different purposes. You just need to identify what that is, and everybody needs to be on the same page, with that. Because otherwise it's just kind of like a time waste status update, thing that could happen over email.
I think that's super important, especially as organizations get bigger. Like this is kind of if you have rhythms established, this is why, kind of the corporate stereotype or whatever starts to kind of play out, is because people start to check boxes, go through the motions. It's kind of blah, blah, blah. Nothing really moves forward. And I think in large part, like the purpose is lost. Like we're just doing this. This is what we do at 9 a.m. every Tuesday. So that's maybe one extreme, but I'd be curious to maybe like sell on, like if maybe there's an entrepreneur that they're just a doer, like they have a high bias towards action. It's like, why do I need to have a one-on-one? Like, can I just like text them or shoot them a voice message and like they should be able to figure it out? How about just like maybe even purpose on like why you should do one-on-ones if you're not doing them consistently?
Yeah. I mean, it's one thing for you to be a doer. And usually most entrepreneurs are, so I don't think that's like uncommon. It doesn't mean that every person in your organization is going to be exactly the same. And it doesn't mean that even someone who's a doer can't use, a little accountability, coaching, and focus, on goals overall. And that's where, again, like getting back to the purpose of it, ultimately you want to know what that individual, like what matters to them, what are they working towards? And if you've set their role up right in the first place, they should have some pretty clear objectives, whatever that may be. Like if you're leading a salesperson, there should be a really clear, sales metric. And that's an easier one probably to break apart than some other roles, but they should just know, this is what I'm working towards. This is why I'm working towards it overall. And then, have a plan that breaks down to make that happen. And part of what you're doing is, you're a great one-on-one meeting. It's almost like a coaching relationship where, the both parties come in, they understand what they're working towards, they understand the purpose of it, and they know like when goals are going to be set or objectives are talked about or something's problem solved, that you're going to talk about it again. And they're all connected to, it's future focused, connected on the next goal. And it's just more likely for performance to happen. So selling the entrepreneur who thinks, why is this worth it? I'd probably look at like, are you doing one-on-ones that are actually influencing the performance of the people you're leading, or are your one-on-ones like check boxes? Because if that's the style of one-on-one, then you're probably right. You probably don't want to keep doing that. But I'd encourage finding like a purpose and a focus and understanding what you're trying to move on performance.
And I don't know if you'd validate this from some of your experience, but just anecdotally, like within Aleph, in our 20 partners that we're working with, we're engaging and supporting the one-on-ones that are happening throughout, these different businesses. And I shouldn't be by now, but I still get surprised at like one meeting, like done at a super high level, can literally change the trajectory of performance for somebody for like a quarter.
Sure.
And every time that happens, I'm like, it couldn't have just been that one meeting. Like there's something else. And there is, like, there's nuance to that. But again and again, I've literally seen people's performance like take dramatic shifts by like a single meeting. And sometimes those are in the field, sometimes those are in the office. But yeah, I mean, they're huge. Okay, that's great. Purpose. I think the second thing you mentioned, prep. What does that mean to you? What does that look like to you?
Yeah, I think like when these are, what happens when any one-on-one meeting, when the preparation is done effectively by both parties, because prep is not just the leader, it's also the person that you're leading. What happens is it allows you to be more future focused. If there's no prep and you go into it just kind of winging it, what just inevitably ends up happening is you're going to spend a good chunk of that meeting kind of data gathering, whether that's data gathering on like results, data gathering on like what do they want to talk about. It's just, there's this huge part that is like kind of filling in the gaps that should have been there from prep. And you're also not able to really reflect on like, okay, what do I think the actual like core issue we need to like solve here, or what is it that we want to move in this meeting? You haven't thought about that in advance. You're just doing, you're winging it. And so your time to even be able to do that gets, really compressed overall. But when, both parties are prepped, especially when this is on a recurring, rhythm, both parties come in and it's like, what happened, what the results were. And ideally there's some core issues surface that you can just dive in and start solving. I just think it makes it a more kind of impactful, substantive meeting. Like you can talk about like the good stuff, which is like what you can do moving forward, versus just trying to like figure out like what is reality, what happened overall. So
totally. I think of Jeff Bezos sort of famously, as I understand it, Amazon meetings would just like, this was so important that people were prepared to engage in conversations that he just started building it into the meetings. So people show up and there's like a long document of here's what we're talking about, here's the relevant data. And it's like, we're all just going to take the first like awkward 10 to 15 minutes and we're all just going to read this document and sit in quiet to just ensure that when you open your mouth, it's like valuable. It's not, you're trying to seem like the data, or you're trying, you know what I mean? And I was always fascinated by that. And yeah, I think similarly, entrepreneurs are busy, leaders are busy, and I mean, that can totally kill the effectiveness of that time that you have together.
Yeah.
If both people are not, how, any thoughts on just like, maybe too, sometimes it's like, what do I need to be prepared on? Is there any shorthands or things that like helped you get efficient? Because there's a reality, especially if you're in a stage where your team is growing, or if you have a general manager and they do have a number of direct reports. Getting efficient at your prep is helpful. Is there anything that's like helped you over the years, or that you recommend, of just like, I don't know, how do you do
Yeah.
prep?
I think for any leader, you want to make sure that you actually have a say in kind of how the prep of the person you're leading is designed, and it should be designed in a way to make it really easy for you to figure out what happened and what do they want to get out of the conversation. And by what happened is not just purely like the actual like KPI or the actual metric. It's also like what are some of the we call the drivers restrainers. What are some of the things that are helping them? What are some of the things holding them back? So you just want to get a good quick snapshot of results and kind of the why behind it. And then the other thing is you want to know what they kind of perceive as the big things that they want to talk about. And when you do this enough times with an individual and you kind of create a rhythm, you'd like those things to be substantive. Like, what are the things that are actually holding them back versus kind of like fluff, more administrative topics that you can quickly hit on. Because what often will happen when you don't have any of this prep and there's no real structure is those little administrative items end up turning into the whole meeting, and then you don't talk about like the real substance behind it. So I think having like a really easy to complete and easy to review prep, and then I would look at it as like macro prep and micro prep. If you have a number of direct reports, like if you have 5 or 6 of these that you're doing, it can help to kind of look at overall themes that are probably going to come up in multiple meetings, but just don't get tied into assuming because you see one overarching theme that that's going to be exactly the problem you need to solve with every single person. Like there's going to be some variances, but looking at it on a macro level and then, looking at the individual prep, that can, that's usually a pretty efficient process overall. So,
and maybe just to highlight there has to be a external prep that both parties can visibly like engage with.
Yeah,
is what you're saying, right? And
sure.
I think there's something of that's so important. Like somebody could, in theory, have their own little Moleskine journal that they do their own individual prep, but if that's only on one side of it and the other, like there's not some common data in preparation that both are able to see, that's where, like, I think some of the magic, would you agree, is like the prep is kind of seen by both people. So that helps speed up the connection.
Yeah. Prep seen by both people, and it should be really easy to complete. Like, I've seen some, prep for these that it's obvious it would take hours to complete. And it's, and then what often will happen is like only a small part of it ends up actually getting complete. So I think, simplicity is important. And yeah, for sure, on both parties being able to see it. You also want to have a bit of a kind of like track like the legacy prep. And what I mean by that, I don't know if that's the right word, but you want to see like how the progression and the momentum of someone over time, because that way you're not like purely focused on this 1 week. Like this 1 week is in the context of, what happened prior. Like if they're on an upward trajectory, or if they've done really well, they had one tough week, or vice versa, they really struggled and there was one kind of outlier, success week. Like that's really important data, because that kind of frames a bit, how you're going to actually, work with them on, their challenges, or making sure that they keep doing whatever worked, on the when they have positive momentum. So
yeah, that's great. I love that. Not hyper focusing on a single week. That's great. Let's keep moving. Your third thing was structure. Now this gets maybe super practical. Maybe you don't necessarily mean it this way, but this is where there's a lot of different books and there's a lot of seminars and there's YouTube videos and there's, so there's a lot of opinions and thoughts on structure, I imagine. But what's important when it comes to structure?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different formats. The first thing is having a clear structure, and a consistent structure, versus like that, like kind of open book. What do you want to talk about? Or like just the pure checklist, style meeting. There should be some, structure. And then, the key is not being like hyper rigid on it. Like it doesn't mean you have to stick to each part of it every single week, depending on kind of what curveballs, get you thrown your way. I would say like key components of a structure, like, regardless of what the overall format is, you probably want some type of check-in. Like you're ultimately still working with the human, and it's important to have that like human connection. What can happen if you don't do a check-in at the beginning? You might dive right into goals, or dive right into, the results, or whatever, the business topics are, and you get into it, and then you find out they have some like really big kind of personal thing, and you're like, okay, I probably should have talked about that up, because that does frame it. Like their lives frame it. So when you have a check-in, you can kind of get a sense of like where their head's at. Are they open to having, this discussion overall? So I just think that check-in is important, because again, this is still about trust and relationship. So regardless of what format, a check-in, and then I think something that like briefly looks at just the reality of results, like something about progress overall. That might be reviewing the KPIs, reviewing what happened, seeing what their goals were, versus actuals. This can be like wins, challenges, updates on goals, whatever. Something that's like progress focused would be the second part. I would say the third part is something that's like support. I'd almost call it like support / problem solving. So you've looked at the past, and now you've kind of ID'd what are we solving for? What are we going to do here? And this is like where a lot of the kind of value add part of these one-on-ones comes into play, is like you're going to solve an actual like issue or challenge they're having. Or you might say like where, you might look at like where they need help or where they need feedback, overall, and you're trying to work through an obstacle in the context of now looking ahead. And I'd say that's the whole, last part, which should be a good sizable chunk of it, is looking ahead. Like whatever the time period is, like if you do these monthly, you're looking at the next month. If you do them weekly, you're looking at the next week. But you want to, look forward and just make sure there's really clear objectives. If you're working with a salesperson, it should be really clear metrics, really clear objectives, a plan that is, realistic. It's something that they can, that they know how they're going to go, execute on that plan. And the big thing that's often missed is whatever that objective is, it should fit with the larger goal. Like the short-term objective, it's got to tie into the larger goal. And that's one of the biggest parts that's missed is, sometimes you set goals and don't necessarily know how it fits into, the person's overall objectives. Like there's got to be a tie in there. So I'd say check in backwards, kind of you're almost doing goals or progress, support, problem solving, and then something that, looks ahead. And most of these frameworks kind of fit into those, have elements of those categories. I just think those are the must-have components of it.
I love that. And I think probably having some structure is somewhat of an anchor that goes back and goes forward. Like, like having a structure helps you better prep, and then it helps you kind of make sure you see the purpose, that it's aligned to an overall goal for that individual. So yeah, that's really good. And I think the check-in thing could be just a write-off, but I do think that's super important, because especially in like busy seasons and stuff, at least from my experience, like you can't fake that too. Like if you're meeting with somebody every week and it's like, all right, so, how was your weekend? Good. All right, let's get after it. It's hard to fake that. And I think it kind of forces leaders in particular to like slow down and actually give thought and time to the person, which then I think that foundation just like, it really enhances whenever you do start to get practical and you do start to get tactical. You're coming from a place of like personal connection.
Yeah.
So it might only be 5 to 10 minutes. If you have like a 30-minute meeting, maybe sometimes these are 30, maybe they're an hour, but it might only be 5 to 10 minutes. but that can really, really set the tone for
Yeah.
the meeting.
And I know this is something that Aleph does quite well, is have like a really clear, structure around this. I'm even thinking, Haakon, to, this conversation, you kind of emulated this. And I know it's not the beginning part. You checked in with me before we recorded this, overall. So anybody who's watching there, you didn't catch the check-in part, but when we did our check-in, you didn't just ask, how's the weather? How was your weekend? Okay, let's move on. We talked about I recently moved out to the East Coast. We talked about my family, talked about, like real meaningful, substantive topics, overall. And that couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 minutes, but that was some real substance in the check-in. You were prepped well in advance. You're emulating, a lot of this stuff. And I'll tell you, that makes a real difference. Like it opens the individual up when there's an actual meaningful check-in. So I think you're spot on with this. Like, it can't be just a quick write-off. It can't be, how's the weekend? How was your weather? Basic stuff like that. Like, you've got to do like a meaningful check-in, and you can do that in a short amount of time.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Okay, next one. This is a big one. Honesty. Why did you choose honesty? Might seem like, why do I need to focus on that?
Yeah, I think this is probably one of, if you take nothing else from this podcast for someone listening, I think this is probably one of the most overlooked core principles of, any one-on-one meeting. And what I mean by this, and I think it's almost what separates like those superficial kind of pointless one-on-ones from like the real, the ones that actually, like what you described, Haakon, how a great one of these can like actually change trajectory for someone. And, what often will happen is, the leader may know they may identify some like real challenge areas with this person, like the person they're leading. They're like, there's core kind of performance things that, they might be dealing with for quite some time. They may see a really clear miss on a goal or whatever it may be. And they ask, okay, what do you want to talk about today? And it's like, we'll use a painting business again as an example. Maybe, the salesperson is like 50% down on their, results. And like, what do you want to talk about today? Well, I had this one specific customer that asked about the color, and I wasn't quite sure if I wanted to, do 2 coat or 1 coat. Can we just talk about that for a while? And then that small granular item turns into the bulk of the conversation, instead of like, that's great, we'll definitely cover that. I just want to make sure like we talk about there's some real things here that we need to dive into. Now, however you articulate that, it's like being direct, being real. And it doesn't mean steamrolling someone. It's just kind of both parties having an understanding that, these one-on-ones are focused on actually moving, performance forward, and having like, the acceptance that like directness is actually going to help the person, move forward. I just think you can't shy away from the directness. You've got to say the hard things, that matters, especially if it's like performance, behavior, something that's going to be, high impact. And the flip side of that is like, whoever the person you're leading is, like, they can't be afraid to speak up. This like really needs to be like a great one-on-one should feel like almost like the safest place to like speak truth, in both ways, like up and down. And when you kind of have that type of like trusting atmosphere where people can really, talk about the realness of performance, I think that's where like the magic, happens overall. But, it's not like a switch that you just flip overall. I think it starts with like, it's like repetition over time of like actually talking about results, being real with it, real, but future oriented. It's not like they miss a goal, they're just going to get screamed at and beat up. And then, then it's not safe, and they're not going to want to hear reality. It's got to be something that's like, you're actually trying to move performance forward, and you're going to talk honestly about that.
Yeah. So important. One of the things that we did talk about was, in our little kind of pre-chat, was energy. This idea of like how important just your energy is in performance. and it can seem like, not that practical, or maybe woo woo, or, managing someone's energy. But I think this is a great example of that too, of kind of feeling safe, feeling like you can actually get the help that you need. And it's like, how much energy does somebody come away from a one-on-one with? It's typically going to go up or down with the degree of like transparency and honesty. Like, how open was the meeting is typically like the more open the meeting, probably the more energizing the meeting.
Yeah.
The more closed off the meeting, and too, again, anecdotally, I think the leader, I resonate a lot with this because it's like the leader setting the tone for this, because Paris Painting, our flagship business, largely exterior business. Summers are crazy, right? Minnesota, we're doing, the lion's share of our work in like half of the months of the year. So it's a grind in the summer, and real things can come up, right? Like a project manager or salesperson is like, my grandma is dying, or I just found out my girlfriend's pregnant, or, what I mean? Like, there could be life stuff that, like, now that might actually really weigh on somebody's energy and their mentality. And if you're not an environment like it takes you 3 weeks to find that out, that can be very detrimental to results, but also too, just like that person lived in that kind of, that state for 3 weeks. Like, that sucks for your team. You want them to be able to express that.
And even if you were genuine, you're like, we're all human. Like, you care about that. Like, you want that person, if they're going through something like that, like it may matter to you, but if you don't do check-ins, if you're not real, if there's not an atmosphere where people can like just actually talk about what's going on and talk about performance, like what's helping, what's hurting, inside, outside, like it can feel to the person like you actually just don't care. If those situations you're describing, if it's like you find out 2 months after the fact, because you just never asked or never checked in, like that's a bad day, overall. So I think you're spot on.
Yeah, there was, I just posted something recently too that this makes me think of is, I got it from Good to Great, the Stockdale paradox. You familiar with this?
Yeah.
So, I think this like how to think about honesty, like, because honesty maybe feels like a risk, like, how honest should I be? But the Stockdale paradox is this idea of, you have to have both, like, you need to hold in your own head and heart this like unflinching belief that success will happen, like, I will get through this, or I will, it'll get better, we'll get there. And I think it's like a unflinching, look in the mirror at like, what are the brutal facts of your situation?
Yeah.
So it's like you got to have
real, but not losing faith in like what you're trying to accomplish still.
Yeah. And so I think I've certainly experienced this. Like, the best leaders are able to do that really well. Like, they're able to maintain a degree of forward thinking, positivity, and belief, while also speaking directly to the truth. And that's the only way that like real progress, gets made. And again, I think too, back to like this earlier thing that we both talked about, like, this is the stuff that makes painting companies, or any company, like, not grow. This is what not doing honesty well in these meetings can literally like make a hire not go well. And then it's like, oh, I got to let them go, or they quit. And now I'm spinning my wheels on, I'm re-recruiting, rehiring, retraining, and it's back, on the hamster wheel.
Yeah. I mean, there's probably, if you're watching this, like, I'd probably think about, is there anybody you're leading who, for months and months on end, like there's some type of like truth, some performance thing that you just have that hasn't been talked about, overall, and then how that feels, because that can be like, it can almost feel like helpless, in a sense, and it can feel impossible when the longer time passes where that like core thing is to talk about. I think it's so important. So
that's great. Okay, the last thing you had said was follow through. Let's jump into that. What does good follow through in a one-on-one look like?
Yeah, I mean, it's I think, well, a couple elements of it. You might put a great plan together during this one-on-one, and not just you, like you and the person you're leading. Ideally, you're collaborating. You have a really solid, performance plan. But they're driving in their car. You're on Bluetooth. They haven't written anything down. Close the meeting. You're like, man, that was a great plan. That's going to go awesome. And then and there's no check-in or anything in between. And then you a week later talk to them, and they don't remember what the plan was. Like, that's it's not surprising. Like, it's tough to keep elements like that just purely in your head, and they might feel motivated at the moment, but then the details kind of dissipate. And also, like, if you might set that, I think another kind of like pitfall with this is you put a great plan together, and then the next meeting you don't even talk about it. You don't talk about, like, how did it go. It's purely the result. It's like, how'd you do? I did this, versus what was the goal and what was the plan and how'd you do? And that type of, like, knowing that when you're going to have a plan, you're going to talk about the follow through. It's going to come up again. It's not just going to be kind of lost into the ether and never spoken about again. Like that. I think that's a really, really important part of these one-on-ones, that there's some substance about what are the actions that are going to come out of this. What is the actual performance that needs to happen in the next period, or what is actually, I shouldn't say needs to happen, the actual performance that person commits to. And then, actually being able to connect back to that commitment. And sometimes people need touch points. People need check-ins. I completed a marathon about two weeks ago. It was my first one in 6 years. And I had, I'd put a plan together with my coach, and like, it was like the long run every week. I knew what I had to do. It's, adding a mile every week from like 10 miles onward. That's just the way, the basic way I would plan. But every time I would, like, take a snapshot of my Apple Watch of, like, okay, 10 miles done. And it's like, that had to happen every single Saturday. There had to be, like, an accountability, a check-in to do it, and it just, I think if there's something like that you can create to give a little, like, more reason behind them going out there and doing the whatever the performance objectives are, I think that's hugely important. So,
yeah, I've heard, and I can't remember where I heard this, but just the idea of, like, the importance of this too is confidence is really like evidence. Like, I think generally speaking, people grow in confidence by building evidence in certain skills that they have. And so I think some of that, like, follow through and almost like show your work kind of a thing is, I think it just lays track for, like, a salesperson to be confident, like if they can report back, yeah, here is clearly the steps I took in light of our last meeting, and here's what I did, tried, experimented with, and here's the result. It's like they're reinforcing that to themselves. Mm-hmm. And they're probably going to be confident. Another quote that comes to mind too is, like, we don't learn from our experiences. We learn from reflecting on our experiences. And this is something I've tried to do, and you can't always do this, but if you do have a one-on-one or you have a team meeting or whatever, like, I've been just trying to build in, like, the 30 minutes after that meeting ends, I'm going to block my calendar so that I don't have to just jump right into the next thing. And, okay, what were my to-dos? Okay, let's get those to-dos into an action plan, into the calendar. And it's like, you don't want to waste, you just spent an hour, like, don't let it go to waste, kind of thing. And that's been a practice that's really helped me. Can't always do it, but
I think that's great, Haakon, because if you wait till, if you're like, okay, I'll catch up on all that, like, in the middle of the week, just like that person not remembering the plan because they're driving, you're on Bluetooth, you're not going to remember it, especially if you did 6 or 7 of these, one-on-ones. It's almost impossible to remember every detail of each one of those on what the action steps are. So yeah, I think that's great what you just described.
So I think, again, man, super helpful, and something I'd love to talk about a little bit, because there's there's two different people. I think you said something to this too of, I hope there's people that listen to this and some of this they're doing well. And then, maybe it's like pick one thing, what, as you go through that structure, like what resonates with, I think that's an area I could work on. But another element is it is different if you're the person doing the one-on-ones or if your business is to a point where you have people under you that are doing one-on-ones. So there's like layers here. And I don't know where this term originates. Maybe it's a College Pro thing. We say it around here a lot. I know you're like who's coaching the coach? Like, how do you coach the coach? So maybe you take this wherever you want, but like, how do you, like make sure your managers are doing this, make sure your leaders, your general managers are doing this kind of structure?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a big one, Haakon, because I think for a lot, if you are a owner where you're starting to put a leadership team in place, like, and if you have whether it's a general manager or integrator or whatever term you use, you have someone who's kind of doing a lot of the one-on-one meetings that you would do if you were like also running operations. So as you kind of step back a little bit and have somebody in that role, I think those individuals will often come, like those integrators or the GM or whoever, often they come from like the ranks of the business. Like they might be a high performer in a more frontline role. Maybe they're, project manager, or if they come from the sales route, maybe they're great in a sales role. Maybe they move in a sales manager role and then do this. It's one thing to have the technical skill, whether that's technical sales skill. Like you may be a fantastic salesperson or fantastic painter or, project manager. It's one thing to have the technical skill. It's another to have the leadership skill. Like that doesn't mean you might be the best salesperson. It doesn't mean that you know exactly how to like lead a great one-on-one, for example. So I think it's as the owner, it's important to not kind of box people in where if they're high performing, in like a number of core skills that you're just going to assume they're going to know how to do, this part of it properly. So I think, making sure that there is a process in place and then, setting it up to where they're actually getting feedback, not on how they describe the one-on-one meetings going, but on actual observed behavior. I think that's a really core part of coaching. It's, so you set them up with the process with all that, you make sure, you train them on it. Maybe they watch you demo a few, but then you have to watch them actually do one of these and then be able to give them, feedback. That is, that is just core to it. And it goes back to this whole thing of like, for performance, you got to understand the difference between training and coaching. Training is more like the knowledge and kind of the how-to, but coaching is the growth, part of it. That's what actually moves things forward. So you do need to give them the how-to. You need to train them, but you can't just then expect, okay, great, now I can step aside and they'll do it. It's like you're going to give them the how, and then you also have to coach them, overall. So, and even highly skilled individuals could, they benefit from coaching. So
that's great, man. And I think maybe too, like in an AI world of training is probably going to get easier and easier, like just because of the proliferation of like information and tools to build, like building playbooks, like you can record yourself on a Fireflies or Otter AI, meeting and then send it to ChatGPT and build a playbook, right? So in 15, 20 minutes, you can have a section of a playbook built, or at least like an MVP really quickly. But I don't think anything's going to happen with coaching, right? Like that is that human element, the honesty, the whatever. And I think that again, in the conversations that I've had with business owners, a theme that has come up is I tried to hire a general manager and it didn't work out. I tried to, get an integrator installed. It didn't work out. And I think most often they hired somebody who had really good technical skills and probably could train people really well, but just did not connect with the team in any kind of like coaching capacity.
For sure. And they delegated versus, getting in there and giving them the support and the coaching that they needed. So.
Yeah. So I even like in an interview process, like I think I would encourage business owners, if you're in a season or a year where, all right, because it's so exciting too. Like that's such a big role, especially for an entrepreneur who probably doesn't want to be doing one-on-ones, or if you're more visionary folk, type, it's like,
Yeah.
man, somebody who could take on my meetings, that's exciting. But I think don't be enamored by somebody's technical skill, over enamored, like how do they do with this kind of stuff? And I think that, do they have reps at this? Can you point to that? I think that's really good. Anything else to say on that topic, coaching the coach?
No, I mean, I think it's just, it has to happen, and it's got to be observed. It's got to be real. It's got to be, actual feedback loop, not just kind of theoretical discussions on it. I think you're spot on. Training, it's one thing to train, but it's another to have that like actual human coaching connection. So, and
I think too, that the long term, like you want people to stay, right? Especially again, like this integrator role is such a big investment. It's an expensive role. Man, if it doesn't work out, it's so painful. Then you're gun shy from like pulling that trigger again, right? Yeah. And so if somebody, maybe they are good at this, but like they themselves don't get really any investment into them, or because maybe there's just a thought of like, well, I hire you to run the business. Like, why do I need to be there? But that encouragement of like getting coaching, and I think that can really just help people. Yeah, that's why I think even owners benefit from coaching. Like everyone, I think, benefits from like real, authentic, coaching. I think that's one of the big strengths of Aleph, overall from what I've seen. So that's great, man. Well, dude, this was great. Really, really good stuff. This is why I was excited to talk to you. So I appreciate it. How can people get in touch with you if they wanted to connect or whatnot? Is there a way to reach out? Yeah, you can. I mean, Core Acceleration's website is just coreacceleration.com. You can find me on LinkedIn, and yeah, it's the easiest way to reach out. So awesome, brother. Well, I appreciate the time. We'll have to do it again in the future. Absolutely. Thanks, Haakon.